All right. I think it's 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and start. Hello and welcome to everyone. We have I think, a lovely large group tonight, which is great. We thank you all for joining us for this year's Early Childhood Speaker event, Tips for Success, Raising Your Kids in the 21st Century. I'm Lori Romero, supervisor of our Arapahoe Library's Child and Family Library Services Department. We focus on early literacy. We so appreciate your interest in learning and being with us tonight. And our team certainly appreciates our library district's continued focus on the importance of early childhood literacy and making great resources and programs available to you, our families, and our community stakeholders. Tonight, we're happy to have a really fabulous early childhood leader with a wealth of knowledge joining us. First, I have just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. The Q&A and chat process. So at 8 o'clock, when she's finished with her presentation, Dr. Jana will answer as many of your questions as possible. She really would like you to interact and be a part of the presentation. So if you do have questions related to the talk or anything specifically for her to answer as we go along, please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully you can see it, and add your question there at any point. If you have more of a logistical question or a library question or a technology issue, use the chat function, which should also be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring that separately to try to help you out. We have a lot of library elves and a tech specialist backstage here. So hopefully we can take care of that. So Q&A for Dr. Laura and the chat for other issues. To teachers, educators out there, please stick around to the end of our presentation and we'll have information about receiving professional development credit hours for attending tonight's event. And to everyone, we will have a follow-up survey that's very short, I promise, that will come to you tomorrow via email from our coordinator, Betsy Brainerd. So please do open it, and we'd really appreciate it if you would fill out the survey. It is short and your feedback is valuable, and it really helps us to work to bring you the resources, programs, and services that are most important to you. And we have prizes. We'll be randomly drawing 10 attendee names after the follow-up surveys are collected and completed. And if your name is chosen, you'll receive a copy of Dr. Jana's wonderful book, The Toddler Brain. I don't know if you can see it. We read it on our team. It is wonderful. You'll receive a copy as well as a great, carefully chosen children's book and a quality toy for your child. So please look for a link to be entered into the drawing, and it will be in that same email from Betsy tomorrow. Finally, Spanish interpretation services are available tonight. I'd now like to introduce Indira Guzman, who will tell us how to use the interpretation service on Zoom. Hi, Indira.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Indira Guzman, and Arapahoe Public Libraries has made a commitment to language justice and creating an inclusive space for this event. And for this, we are going to use the tools of simultaneous interpretation. In a second, we're going to turn on the interpretation icon, and you will be able to select the language that you prefer to listen in. We'll only be providing interpretation in English or Spanish. I will repeat this in Spanish now. Muy buenas tardes, mi nombre es Indira Guzmán y Arapahoe Public Libraries ha hecho un compromiso con la justicia del lenguaje para este evento. Entonces, en un momento vamos a aprender el icono de interpretación y usted puede seleccionar el idioma que prefiere utilizar. Puede ser inglés o español. Entonces, por favor, seleccione el idioma en un segundo cuando prendamos el botón de interpretación. Muchas gracias. And we could turn on interpretation.
Okay, Fantastic. Thank you, Indira. And now I'd like to invite Cynthia Kiyotaki, who's my boss and our manager of our early literacy department and the manager of many more things, actually, for the Arapahoe Libraries. She's also very supportive and passionate about the importance of early childhood. And she will introduce tonight's speaker. Hi, Cynthia.
Thank you, Lori. Boy, do I wish I had this book when my kids were little. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Lori. I serve as one of the library managers for Arapahoe Libraries. We thank you for your virtual visit today to learn more from pediatrician Dr. Laura Jana. As Lori mentioned with the book, Dr. Jana is the award-winning author of The Toddler Brain, Nurture the Skills Today That Will Shape Your Child's Tomorrow. This evening, she will share a strategic plan for raising kids in the 21st century and introduce parents and caregivers to the necessary skills that will equip children for whatever comes their way. You will learn how to formulate an effective yet relaxed parenting plan that keeps the big picture in focus. Dr. Jana is the mother of 3 and has also authored Heading Home with Your Newborn and Food Fights, along with over 30 children's books. She currently holds a faculty appointment at Penn State's Prevention Research Center and continues to serve in her longstanding role as an author and media spokesperson for the American Academy of Pediatrics. As a reminder, you will be able to see and hear Dr. Jana, but she will not be able to hear or see you. Welcome, Dr. Laura Jana.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to at least virtually join all of you. The only thing better, I think, would be to get to join you in person. As you will find out, I'm very big and I spend a lot of my time talking about the importance of human connection and relationships and things. So as you heard, we're going to go into the talk, and then I do want to make sure that I have time at the end to answer the questions that you're submitting along the way. I've got someone helping me in the background here collecting the questions so we can get to as many as possible. But what that also means is I'm going to warn you, I'm going to forewarn you, it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. And it doesn't matter how much time I'm given to speak. What I find is that to sort of do justice to this idea of the day-to-day of parenting and early childhood and early brain science, but putting it in a much bigger context that I have found not only is really useful for those of us who day-to-day interact with young children, but also useful across sectors all the way up to the level of the economics and policy and World Bank level, means it's going to be a whirlwind. So I'm going to cut the beginning of the talk where I do some of that context a little bit shorter and just give you the highlights so that we can spend more time at the end on the details that I often don't get time to spend time on related to a framework of skills for success and what they look like, how they develop in the early years, and how you can cultivate them, including how you can use books to do that. All right, so I just hit the wrong button, but I'm going to switch over to share my screen, and then we are going to go ahead and start the presentation. So I'll pop that up. And I assume somebody will tell me if you're not seeing what I'm seeing, but you should be seeing the title, The Tips for Success, Raising Your Kids in the 21st Century. So we're gonna jump right in, and somebody in the back end will just tag me if something's not coming through well. Hang on a second here, I'm gonna minimize my little sidebar of people so it's not over my screen here. All right, there we go. Okay, so you will find that in general, I try hard not to actually read word for word what is on the screen for you, but I do find it helps to kind of give you some anchoring because we're going to cover a lot of information. And in this case, I figured I'd kind of put some big picture objectives, which I sort of referred to already, but we're going to talk about early brain and child development. We're going to talk about the really critical role of caring, responsive adults, not only just in the day-to-day lives, but in the literal brain building of young children's brains. And we're going to talk about 7 key skills for 21st century success and what they look like in early childhood. And we're going to discuss ways specifically, and I'm going to give a few examples all along the way. I'm going to try to pepper it in about how early literacy and library-related opportunities are so good for supporting all of what we're talking about tonight. As a little side comment to add to my bio, Yes, I'm a pediatrician. I was a practicing pediatrician starting back in the 90s, but I also had the good fortune to train with one of the founders of one of the country's biggest early literacy programs that was based in pediatric offices, so Reach Out and Read. And I became a national trainer. I talked about the developmental milestones of early literacy, and I've told the crew here at the Arapahoe Libraries that this invitation to speak made me so excited, because I actually make it a personal goal to integrate early literacy and the developmental milestones of early literacy into pretty much everything I do, including things like my Food Fights book. There is a chapter that relates to early literacy. So we're gonna keep on going here. Now I need to figure out how, oh, there we go. I gotta figure out how to turn my slides and not lose you all on the screen sharing. Okay, so I also, among other things, because I've written books, because I'm a spokesperson for the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I tend to deal in very practical topics for parents and having to do with young children, I've ended up getting asked to do a lot of media, which means I've done a lot of media training, which means that I am very well aware of the fact that I might put you all to sleep if I don't pepper this with a couple questions and things for you to think about to really kind of grab your attention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you the question that I used to start the first TED Talk I gave in Omaha 6 years ago now. I was like, wow, 5 years, but now it's 6. It's almost 6 years ago. And it's a long question, but I want you to concentrate on the pieces of this, okay? And then we're gonna dive in. So what if, despite the best of intentions, despite all our business savvy, data-driven, technology-informed know-how, and all that the information age has put right at our fingertips, we are nevertheless raising our children to succeed in a world that no longer exists? And here's what I can tell you. Whenever I ask that question, it doesn't matter who the audience, economists, parents, preschool teachers, you name it, that gets everyone's attention. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna kind of, in the course of this hour of talk and then the discussion afterwards, we're gonna kind of funnel down into the details of that and how it relates to your day-to-day interactions with young children and early literacy. That's the task. Okay. To simplify that really big overarching concept that really makes you think, wow, now I think I might have a headache, and that's enough thinking about it, we're going to talk about 3 simple things. And again, you heard reference to sort of a strategic plan. Technically speaking, strategic plans are defined by where are we now, where are we going, and how will we get there. This is analogous to that. We're going to talk about why now. Why are we talking about this now in particular? Why early? Like, why are we talking about early childhood? I mean, birth to 5. And why us? What role do we play? Why are we so critical to this, this big picture? So the first question, why now? This is where I'm going to give you a snapshot. And I would like to think that in giving you a snapshot, you will start to be able to think of things that you heard on the morning news, that you hear discussed every day. Maybe you have it at work. Maybe you have it just sort of in conversations. But it's what's going on in the world today. So if we look at this, and again, I frame it as not just what's going on in the world, because then that's just a current events talk and that's not what you signed up for. Let's think about it as the world that our children are going to live in. Because that framing is actually a really important one, because if our job, in whatever capacity you're here as, librarian, educator, early educator, parent, administrator, if your job is to help prepare children for that world, we better know what that world looks like. And in very simple terms, I think it's important to think about the fact that we've now shifted from industrial age to information age. Again, no, that's not a big news flash for anyone. But if we think about what that means, and we think about sort of the industrial era, the one-size-fits-all, mass production, assembly line approach, what happened is as that became the norm in the last century, it carried far over into the way that we approached educating children. Right? So this sort of sit in a straight line, show up on time, clock in, clock out, sit still, crisscross, applesauce, whatever it is. And everybody does the same thing at the same time. As we shift into the information age, in fact, what we've found is that it's not just, information age, but an abundance of information, so much so that I often use the expression, it's like we're getting new information given to us through a fire hose. And what I want you to think about, and we're going to talk about it in more detail, is what that means for what skills become important. When you go from that one-size-fits-all assembly line, get the right answer in a very nice timed fashion, to there's an abundance of information. The last billion people on the planet are said to be coming online, hopefully relatively soon. But for most people, and we need to be working on this, having access to information should become universal. And it's often now being discussed as something we need to consider as a human right. Okay, then it becomes a very different discussion of what do you do with the information and all. The other thing that we look at as very big trends in the world around us is that we've gone from sort of a local and linear worldview kind of sense of where we are in the world to global and exponential. Now, even before the pandemic, I used to take time to explain these concepts. I would use the local to global example by saying every infectious disease is only a plane ride away. And unfortunately, we all know that that is absolutely true. So I'm not going to belabor the point. But if you want to think about other examples, the internet, right? The fact that I'm talking to all of you now, but we can't be in person, means that we are all connected in a much more global way. And that has definite implications for what skills become important, because it's not enough for me to be able to just get along with my neighbor in a literal geographic sense anymore, but rather that we have to be able to cross cultures and continents and professions and all these other things as we become more globally connected. The other element, though, I used to spend a little more time explaining the concept of linear to exponential. Linear being nice, straight. I always have to think of which way I'm doing it in reverse for the screen. But linear, going up in a straight line and it's predictable. In the business world, this would have been the 10-year plan. You decide where you want to be in 10 years and what's that step up, the rungs up the ladder to get there. Now, however, and again, before the pandemic, I would say, okay, here's the thing. The idea now is that anything, and you see I've got written on the bottom underneath the local and linear, it says digital age and the relentless march of technology. I don't have to tell anybody that technology has really infused everyday life all across the planet. But what that means is that the idea that anything that makes use of technology or is dependent on technology begins to change exponentially fast. I'll spare you the details from the tech world about Moore's law and the doubling of information that can fit on a silicon chip. But in a literal sense, technology picks up very quickly at an exponential rate. And for anyone who math wasn't their best subject, that exponential doesn't really mean something to, it means doubling, okay? This has come up many times with the pandemic because it's how much do you spread the virus? And if it's to one person spreads it to 2 and 2 people spread it to 4 and 4 people spread it to 8, that's where we see exponential, that big shoot up the curve that everyone talks about. But the same thing holds true for anything that doubles. And what that means is we're seeing rapid change, oftentimes technology fueled, certainly pandemic fueled, but we're seeing exponential change, and we are, as humans, tend to be wired for expecting linear change, nice and predictable up this path. And what you see on an exponential curve is you go 2 to 4 to 8. And in a very big curve, that looks kind of linear, right? It's still kind of going like this. But when we get 16, 32, 64, 128 and up, all of a sudden it shoots up and catches us by surprise. And rapid change is one of the things we're going to talk about. And lastly, which I already alluded to with this sort of globally complex and connected world, is that what we're seeing a major shift from silos, everything divided. And again, in my case as a pediatrician, people ask me if I miss being a pediatrician now that I'm not in clinical practice and seeing kids day to day in an office. And I always say, I think I still am one, but I don't see being able to separate education from health and pediatrics from all these other areas because they're very interconnected. And all of our systems are trying to wrestle with that as people become aware. So that's the big picture world we're living in. In simple terms, we're also seeing things like the rise of emotional intelligence, right? In a world of technology, what becomes really valued, and it's the sort of human qualities that computers don't do well, like being emotionally intelligent. Same thing, like I referenced, the plan to adapt. And in fact, we've got a quote, but there's lots of them out there that I like from former Secretary of Education. It said, in essence, here's the summary of what I just said. For practical purposes, we are currently preparing students for jobs and technologies that don't yet exist in order to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet. So that's a bit of a challenge, and it is the framing that we have to work with. Okay, so that's what we've got for a kind of success in the bigger picture world our children will live in. And then that begs the question, and I always put it this way, but again, you'll see at the bottom of the screen here, I framed, again, with somewhat of a question, my second TED Talk, which I gave in Northern India 2 years ago. That's much more specific to the talk I'm giving today in case anyone's interested. It's a nutshell version. It's much shorter. But I said, around the world, everyone from governments, business leaders, and economists to parents, teachers, and pediatricians are all asking the same question. What skills will our children need to succeed in the 21st century, in today's world? Okay, so we've laid the framework, and we say, what skills? Now, conveniently enough, the World Economic Forum came out with a list of the top 16 skills most needed to succeed in today's world. This was a report for education purposes of what we need to be doing to educate kids to succeed. And I will just add the little caveat now. My worldview is not entirely defined by defining success by jobs and workforce. But it is an area where if we can make sure that people who determine policy, who focus on jobs and workforce and higher education and K-12 education recognize what we're talking about and that we all have these shared goals, these are really important things to take into account. So that's the framing I used. But let's take a closer look at these skills, okay? Now, I know it's a little hazy. Even if we were on a big screen in person, it would be hard to read this. That's because I don't need you to pay attention to the details there yet. I want you to look at the 3 colored columns. So the first column, the purple column, are what I have called IQ skills, because I think that's using the sense of IQ, it's not the literal IQ test, but it tends to make parents, educators, anyone who works with children alike, kind of think of the reading, writing, arithmetic-like skills. And you can see vaguely on the list here. We're talking literacy, numeracy, scientific literacy, civic literacy, those sorts of things. So it's sort of that fact-based, multiple choice, fill in the blank, binary kind of answers. And I always say, and you'll notice, it's about 1/3 of the skills most important for succeeding in today's world, okay? And recognized globally as really important skills. 1/3 of the skills, still very important. So what I always tell people, because I know there's a lot of you very involved in early literacy, is I am absolutely not saying that reading, writing, and arithmetic are not important. But what I think has probably happened, and I think if you think back, you'll agree with me, is that the way we've interacted with children, educated children from their earliest days, weeks, months, much less years, is that we've focused on these skills. So I always say sort of that flashcard approach. So those are the IQ skills, very important, but I think most of our focus had been shift over many past decades to this category. Now I want you to look at the other columns, the orange and the blue. Okay, so now as big categories, what we find is, and you can kind of, because you're looking at a screen, see the fine print better than most people would if we were in a big auditorium. The orange skills relate to global complexity. Okay, so we talked about that in part of our framing. And the other relate to rapid change. And, because usually people can't read this list, I always say, listen, I pulled them out for you, right? And while I see the list that the World Economic Forum came up with, here's what I was already using on my own before this report conveniently came across my desk. Communication, collaboration, teamwork, adaptability, resilience, grit, perseverance, emotional intelligence, the ability to fail and adapt, EQ, and all those things that everybody, doesn't matter if I'm talking to Fortune 100 CEOs, all nod their head at me and say, yes, 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 that's what we all care about. Those skills are very important. Nobody questions this list of skills, okay? And what you see at the top of the list, which my picture is conveniently blocking for me, but that's okay. We typically call these soft, non-cognitive, and other skills, all right? So those 2 categories. And I want you to hold that thought, okay? Because what I'm going to do is we're going to get back to that list of skills. But first say, okay, if we can all agree, these skills make up 2/3 of the skills identified as the most important skills for success in today's world, then we get to the why early. Okay, see, I thought this was a talk about early childhood and early literacy and early brain development. Why are we talking so early when these are skills important for the workforce and jobs and future success? And this is where we're going to take a little dive into the brain science and the early child development. But I like to start with a very practical sort of approach, because again, in my earliest efforts outside of just my pediatric practice, I had the very good fortune of working with the person who at the time had been recognized recently as the world's most famous pediatrician and one of the most influential people of last century. That would be Dr. Benjamin Spock. And in getting to work with him, I very quickly transitioned over to the idea that anything I said or did interacting with parents or with people working with young children needed to be really practical and tangible. Because I can tell you all the information I want, but if you don't know what to do with it or it doesn't relate to your life, that doesn't help you. So here's my real life slide about parenting, because I've spent about 20 years, a lot of the media I've done is around parenting and parenting advice. And here's where I'd always do. I like a little bit of humor and a little bit of reality mixed in. The first one, the one on the left that says, can I call you back in 5 years, is the one that I say, if you just added one more child, that would have been me, because I did have my 3 children over the course of 3.5 years. I have a surgeon husband. We did not have family around. And this is actually what I felt like. Okay. So I think it's an acknowledgement of what's involved in raising young children. Because if we're going to talk about all these important things that people can and should do or shouldn't do, we always have to keep in mind that this is the context in which parents are living. The next one, because we're about to talk about the brain science, I found kind of amusing, and I thought perhaps some of you might as well. But the idea that I used to have functioning brain cells, but I traded them in for children, gave me a good chuckle. And if for no other reason, not even to negative comment about children, but even just from sleep deprivation, we now know, and it's a different talk, that sleep is really important for functioning brain cells. So I find that one particularly useful. And then the last one, that pile of diapers, is basically what you get when you Google big pile of diapers and look at images. But it is my reminder to point out that that we are, and again, I oftentimes translate what I'm talking about into sort of a more business language, a language that people who are out in the business world might relate to. I say, I feel like sometimes we're parenting by quarterly earnings. And what that means, for those of you who don't know the business lingo, it's sort of a negative thing, but it's understandable, which is we focus on the short term. In the business world, the focus on the next quarterly report and quarterly earnings is really, companies are judged on that, but it's short term. It's every quarter. The problem is that by sometimes putting your head down and getting buried in the quarterly earning factors, or in this case, buried in the clothing, crying, car seats, and diapers, it becomes understandable but problematic that you never look up and look at the big picture. What's happening in the long term? Where do you want to head in the long term? Because you're too busy dealing with that short term, again, diapers being the example. So this is the reminder that, and again, even if you sit with me just for this talk, you're going to look up, you're going to see the big picture, and then we're going to right back down to the day-to-day and how to apply it. But it's really important because we know the first 5 years are so critical and such an awesome opportunity to impact children's ability to thrive in the world. Okay. The other thing about why early, and I won't belabor this because I imagine most of you, since you all have some form of interaction with young children, I start with the practical before we get into the neuroscience, which is starting early is intuitive, right? We know this from a parenting standpoint. I've done some of my children's books. One is called Melvin the Magnificent Molar, about a tooth that lives way, way, way in the back of the mouth and sometimes gets forgotten, and he has to yell so that people remember, that his owner remembers to brush him. People ask me, when should they start brushing teeth? How soon after they get teeth? And I say, why wait for teeth? Because the habit, a healthy habit is easier to instill early, whereas bad habits, you want to get rid of them as soon as you can. Same thing holds true with potty training. All I tell people, and again, I wrote a book called It's You and Me Against the P for potty training. Again, adding in or infusing positive parenting approaches, but also this idea that when people ask me how early they can or should start potty training, I always tell them it depends what your expectations are. Because if you're talking about potty learning and exposing kids to concepts in toddlerhood that will help them become comfortable with the concept and with the bathroom and with the flushing of the toilet and things, you can start really early. But if you start really early and you expect them to accomplish it, that's a problem. And the same holds true with reading. I always say, listen, you don't even have to wait for the baby to be born, because we know that if you enjoy it, the baby can hear your voice in utero, and you go from there. In the business world, the same thing holds true, however. So if we're going to say, listen, this spans the entire lifetime, top companies engage employees from the minute they show up on the job. It's sort of short-sighted to say, hey, I'll check in on you next year and see how that first year went for you, because everyone knows that employee turnover is a very big problem, and that if you help employees really get that firm foundation, it's important. The quick part here that I always want to mention is what starting early isn't, because having owned an educational childcare center myself with almost 200 kids in it for nearly 10 years, what I found is that a lot of people thought they were coming and they were like, this is going to, I always say, it's not a flashcard academy. This isn't teach your 9-month-old to read. Doesn't teach your 9-month-old to potty train. For the early literacy piece, I always say it's not about teaching your child to read early. It's about teaching your child an early love of reading. Because the reading part itself, in the literal ABC sense of it, comes with that. But if you don't establish this love of shared reading early on, that's much more difficult later on. And to the people who are now thinking, and this will date some of us in the crowd here, the book that was hugely popular bestseller in the 1980s called All I Really Needed to Know, I Learned in Kindergarten, people start going, oh, this is like what you're talking about, All I Needed to Know. Very interesting, useful book, lots of good tips, including not just the ones you think of, but things like remembering to close the toilet seat after you go to the bathroom, for the males in the crowd here. But here's what I will tell you, the 2 modern day updates to that concept contained in that best-selling book is, 1, we now know that a lot happens before kindergarten. And we also, I always tell people, while it may not be rocket science, we now know it's brain science. And so we're going to keep moving on to that part. And again, for sake of time, so I don't overwhelm people with lots of pictures of neurons and things, I'm giving you a very abbreviated overview so that you kind of have this sense of awe and opportunity about what's going on in the baby brain, which has been difficult because until we knew what was going on, it was too easy to just think babies were cute and they needed their diapers changed, right? And then they cry sometimes and you have to feed them. What we now know are these, and you can see the facts here, that babies are born with about 100 billion brain cells, which for those of you who care, totals more, I'm told, than the number of stars in the Milky Way. That 85% of brain growth takes place in the first 3 or so years. And I always caution people, because you'll hear people say brain development. If 85% of our brains were developed by 3 years of age, we all would be in big trouble. But we're talking about brain growth, which is laying the foundation, like the structural foundation, and it is tremendous growth with up to 1 million new neural connections forming per second. Okay, now, on the left for the images, in case anyone's interested in what this means, neuroscience was one of my areas of study. So I get very excited when the neuroscience catches up to what a lot of us who work with young children have already recognized about children and their behavior and their potential. But what you see is from the newborn to 2-year column, what you're seeing is actual brain cells, so neurons, and the lines are the connections between them called synapses. So neurons connect through synapses, brain cells do. And what you see is 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, increasing number of connections. But here's the thing, it is not simply he or she with the most connections that wins, because it's actually more a matter of the strength of the connections that matter. And in fact, what you see at 4 and 6 years is a thinning out, or what's referred to as pruning, of those synapses, those connections. The ones that don't get used get pruned away, and the ones that do get used strengthen. Now, if you want to think of that in a very sort of real world sense, picture yourself walking across a field full of tall grasses. And you walk across it once, the grasses close up, you can't even tell you were there. But if you walk back and forth every day, you clear a path, it gets much easier, you probably get quite a bit more faster, you can maybe even ride your bike across that path. You're creating almost like a super highway versus a hard to get across path. Now I want you to think of brain cells the same way. And so then it becomes, for better or worse, a use it or lose it scenario. And that is absolutely fantastic to know if you're in the business of talking, cooing, singing, playing, and reading books to babies. It's not ideal if young children find themselves in circumstances of whatever it may be, abuse, neglect, or sort of repetitive behaviors that are not ideal, or environments that are not ideal. Okay. Now, another way of looking at the baby brain, and again, we're just going to touch on this quickly so you can see sort of this overview of this overwhelming amount of baby brain science that's really picked up in this, this century. This is where we're moving into the science of baby brain development, neuroimaging, and everything. But what we see, and again, you don't have to concentrate too hard on these graphs, but on the 3 curves on the graph there. But this information is coming from one of the central areas responsible for kind of pulling all of this information together, and that's the Harvard Center on Developing Child. And what it shows is that first curve, the yellow curve, is vision and hearing. And we see that comes online. The brain is wired and ready to go at birth, right? Rapid increase at birth of vision. And you know this from a practical, everyday standpoint. Okay, same thing. If I tell you that there's a rapid rise in the brain's language centers in that first year, the second column, the blue one, that probably comes as no surprise to any of you. And then by age 5, so if you look at the curve, look at the upswing of that red curve, the higher cognitive functions like thinking, reasoning, and communicating, those come in by age 5. Now, those skills, right, are what we kind of relate to or refer to, or you may have heard referenced as executive function skills. And I always emphasize the conveniently named executive function skills. And what I did, I know I hesitate to put the slide up, but I debate whether to take it off or not. But what I want you to understand about executive function skills is that just look at the yellow. There's lots of details here to kind of explain it. But the yellow is they represent self-control, cognitive flexibility, right? The ability for the brain to switch gears, and working memory, the ability to take in and hold new information in your brain and then change your course of action afterwards. So overall, the executive function skills serve really important purpose in that they are what allow us to stop, think through our actions, make decisions based on what's going on around us, all right? Now, what I'll show you here, just so you can see, is what often catches people by surprise is that the executive function skills have their most rapid rate of development between the ages of 3 and 5. I don't think I can point, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but from 3 to 5, you can tell me later in the Q&A whether anybody saw my arrow, but that from 3 to 5 is the most rapid rate of development of those skills, okay? And when we're talking about, like, for example, the cognitive flexibility portion, right? I said here, we're gonna flip back. Number 2, cognitive flexibility. In a world that is changing exponentially fast, where the ability to adapt, right, fail, adapt, make new, change course, those sorts of things is highly, highly valued and important. If your brain can't do it, you can't do it. So cognitive flexibility is really important. Same thing, self-control, self-management. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit more later, but I wanted to point that out. The other thing I wanna point out here, without being able to spend too much time on it, is the fact that the executive function skills develop and are sort of housed in the prefrontal cortex, front part of the brain. So you can see it labeled here. The prefrontal cortex, again, is where the executive function skills live, and the amygdala is sort of this more primitive part of the brain that makes us, it's sort of the fight or flight part of the brain. And it's what makes us respond when we feel threatened or emotional or upset. And so the way I explain this is, and if one of you were sitting near me and we were in, I was giving a talk on the stage, I'd pick one of you who was sitting right up towards the front. And I'd say, okay, let's just say Betsy and I here. I said, if we are both approached, because you might, and again, the framing for this is, you might be thinking, wow, prefrontal cortex, executive function skills are awesome. I wish we could turn those on all the time. Most parents I know do, because it's the counter to the amygdala's impulsive behaviors, not thinking through your actions. So let me give you this scenario. Betsy and I are sitting here and we see a saber-toothed tiger coming up, okay? And we are sitting in person, not virtually. So we are sitting right here near this saber-toothed tiger, and the tiger starts coming towards us. If I stop and I think, well, I wonder if he ate breakfast this morning, because if he ate breakfast or, lunch today, had a big lunch, then he may not be that hungry, so I don't have to really run very fast. Or maybe I just have to look and see what kind of shoes Betsy's wearing, and I see that, she's got her slippers on because no one can see her feet, and I've got my tennis shoes. So as long as I run faster than Betsy does, we're all fine. I'm good, right? If my brain stops to use my prefrontal cortex and think through those actions, right? Working memory, take in new information, kind of consider the outcomes. Both Betsy and I are lunch or dinner, right? Because you do not have the luxury when you are very threatened to stop and think through all the options that you might have. Now, the reason I take the time to say this is because this very significantly relates to children who are growing up facing poverty, adversity, food insecurity, whatever it may be, but that sort of level of sort of constant stress or feeling threatened, what happens is that it actually makes very good sense for their amygdala to be in charge, and they react to threats, which means that they don't do so well with sitting down and listening at story time, taking turns, thinking through what might happen if they do one thing versus another. And that's where we then end up having to really focus attention on helping rewire kids' brains who are in environments that pose threat over those early years. Okay, sorry that was a little bit jumbled, but I wanted to get there. I'm gonna pick up a little bit here just so we can spend time on these skills and still have plenty of time for Q&A, which if anybody joined in late, if you send in your Q&A questions now, you will not distract me because I'm not looking at them, but I have somebody looking at them for me. And then that way we'll have them all ready to go in the Q&A session. Okay, again, last part, why early, or a different way of looking at it. We did the brain science as a quick overview. It's often been said that third grade, or recognized in the education world, that third grade reading scores predict future life success, okay? But here's what I'm gonna tell you. What if 18-month vocabulary is looking like it's predictive of third grade reading scores? That gets people's attention because in third grade, here's the concept. If you spend the first few years of life, of education, right, elementary school, learning to read, you spend the rest of your life reading to learn. And the idea is that if we can get kids to a third grade reading level, then even if they are in circumstances that are less than ideal and they don't have a lot of support around literacy, they have enough literacy skills to be able to learn on their own. But now we need to recognize that the foundation is being laid long before lots of people are paying attention. The other way that I talk about looking at long-term outcomes is a study that was done by my now colleagues at Penn State University, who spend a lot of time focused on social emotional learning across all ages. And what they did was they looked at long-term outcomes in 25-year-olds based on how they were scored by their kindergarten teachers in kindergarten. And this isn't reflective of the kindergarten teachers. This is reflective of what exposure and what skills they had in kindergarten. And the kinds of skills I'm talking about are those soft non-cognitive other skills. I always say, you know, like playing nice and sharing with others, okay? And what was found in this study, 25-year-olds looking long-term outcomes in a very large number of children in a very well-designed study, was that they were more likely to graduate from high school, get a college degree in early adulthood, and have full-time employment at age 25. And on the flip side of that, be less likely to have teen pregnancy, depression, run-ins with the juvenile justice system. So that means that if you want to ask me why early, you've got the brain science, you've got all sorts of predictive value of these skills being very foundationally important for predicting future life success. I think I'm going to skip over this one only because I see the time and I want to make sure, but I do reference it in my TED Talks and it is in the Toddler Brain, and someone can ask me about it if they want to hear the examples of the predictive power of marshmallows towards the end. Here's another way of looking at this that's really important because this captures the essence of why early in one slide for people who like graphs. On the left, you see the brain's ability to change in response to experiences over time. So from early, very early, all the way up to the age of 70. And this is by a neuroscientist who published this. You can see Pat Levitt. And it goes down. It doesn't go away. This is the, you can always teach old dogs new tricks, but the brain's ability to change is it's easiest the younger you go. And the amount of effort it takes to get those changes goes up with age. The other way of looking at that, and this slide is the one that often gets referenced, and if anyone's going to use one slide, this is the one they use. This is called the Heckman curve. And most notably, James Heckman is a Nobel Prize winning economist. And as you see in the quote, he now is one of the leading advocates for investments in early childhood, not because he decided to focus on early childhood just sort of as an area and then study it. He literally asked which sector of our economy would be the best sector to invest in to have a good return on investment. And as you see, again, I'll explain the graph just because you don't even have to look at all the details. What you have to understand is that on the vertical, on the y-axis, it's how much return on investment you get for whatever you're doing, right? Whatever interventions you have in literal financial dollars, dollars and cents kind of return, okay? And along the bottom, you can see it starts prenatal on the left and goes all the way up through schooling and all the way past to job training and beyond. If you were going to be strategic about where to invest, whether you wanted a return for the child and the connecting of their neurons for sort of a community or school, or for an economic return on investment, everything points us to those earliest years to get the biggest return on investment. And again, now we're going to switch over to sort of what are we talking about when we're saying what are we investing? What are we doing? And how are we going to do it? Like, why us? What is it that we bring to this? Okay. Now, what I emphasize doesn't matter the audience. I could be talking, when I first started giving this talk, I was specifically talking to early educators, childcare, preschool teachers, parents, pediatricians, but I was talking about the importance of human interaction. And then making the point, summing up what we talked about, that the strengthening of connections and assembling of the 21st century toolkit of skills that we said we all value is inherently dependent on a caring, responsive adult. Okay, and in fact, you'll hear terms like socially gated learning and serve and return, but it is actually thought, and the same person I referenced before, the neuroscientist Pat Levitt, the first of the two curves I showed you, I was speaking right after him, and he got up and he spoke and he said, I'm going to go over some myths about baby brains. And he said, the first myth is that babies' brains are like sponges. And I went, what? Like, you think the baby brain is a sponge and that they just absorb everything around them. And he said, because here's the thing. It takes social interaction. Social interaction is like a switch, and it gets flipped, and then their brains function like sponges. So there is all of a sudden a shift. If you heard about relational health, the serve and return back and forth interactions, it's because we now very clearly recognize that it's not a standalone thing, that the child's development is happening independently, and that actually we, as you can see, as chief engagement officers, those engaging with young children, are literally sort of the architects of children's brains and the connecting of neurons. So that's where I say, why us in that sense. I can tell you, however, the same thing and the same recognition is happening across the world of pediatrics. Okay, I took that slide out just to make it a little shorter. And it's happening across the world of business, right? Here you get another economist, and this was me speaking at the US Chamber of Commerce, where he spoke right after me. And he said, think of early childhood development as economic development. Okay, so that the business world has a role to play. Early educators have a role to play, pediatricians, parents, in the sense of how do we make sure that every child has access to a caring, responsive adult. Now, here's where we get to the skills. It's still going to be a whirlwind, but what I did was I'm going to give you a framework, because here's the thing. Remember, we talked about soft, non-cognitive, and other skills. And I think I have the list here for you. Oops, nope, I don't have the list. I took out the list. It was all the communication, collaboration, teamwork, critical thinking, curiosity kinds of skills. Here's what I'll tell you. We don't have anything to call them, because soft, non-cognitive, and other really just doesn't cut it. If I ask most people, would you like some soft skills or some hard skills? Okay, what do they say? If I tell you that I was a cellular molecular biology major, was going to be a neurosurgeon, minored in math, was going to be a double major in math, you think, wow, that's really impressive. And if I tell you that I write books like It's You and Me Against the P, and I love reading books to babies, people think I'm a really nice person. I might get a pat on the shoulder, like, you must be a really nice person. And while I am, it doesn't hold the same value yet to the general public. It's getting there. We're starting to see the rise of these sort of soft skills and their importance and recognition of their importance, but doesn't do them justice. I just told you the brain science, so let's just say, let's agree, non-cognitive is a misnomer. And as someone who's done lots and lots of media, I can assure you that if you've ever wanted to convince somebody something is really important, it's a bad idea to call it other. So having already shown you what I was about to flip to, this is where I came up with the framework of what I called key skills, right? So you see the QI. I pronounce it key intentionally when I was coming up with a word to use, because it sounds like KEY. So even if you're not paying attention to me and I say there are 7 key skills that are really important for, healthy development and future success for children, you're going to pay attention because you think they're important, whether I'm talking about QI or KEY. The other thing that we know about key, which also is sometimes pronounced chi, and this is usually, if I were looking in the audience, some of you be going, oh, now I know what she's talking about, chi. The concept of chi does not just apply to Asian cultures. It has actually been recognized across and used across continents and cultures and centuries, all having some form of meaning related to positive life force. Right? Positive energy, positive life force. And we certainly would like to make the case that these skills have significant impact as a positive life force. Okay? And what we know about ki or chi is that you can also not only be born with it, but you can develop it. And that's really important, because for concepts that we're trying to talk about, like empathy and perspective taking, some people say, oh, you're either born with that or you're not. And while some people may be stronger than others, we now know, down to the neuroimaging of the regions of the brain involved, that it's trainable. In fact, if you look at Tibetan monks' brains, and it's been studied, when you look at things like compassion and empathy, it's like looking at the world bodybuilding contest of those regions of the brain. Okay, now I'm going to say the 7 skills for you: me, we, why, will, wiggle, wobble, what if. Okay, Meant to sound a little Dr. Seuss-like. This is why you are all my people, because I always try to make it a little fun. I think a good children's book is good for adults too. But it's also meant to resonate across all sectors. And what I can tell you is this framework works just as well for the parent of a 1, 2, 3-year-old as it does for a Fortune 100 CEO. And I've literally sat next to a Fortune 100 CEO who, after I gave my talk, started using the names of all these skills in his presentation that followed. Okay, here is my overview of these skills, and then I'm happy to elaborate on anything people would like to talk about in the Q&A, preferably related to the topic of the day. Me skills. Now, keeping in mind, you do not need to memorize these. They are on my website, they're in the book, they're in the TED Talk. Just get an essence of it, because my goal is that by the end of this, you don't have to think about what these mean. You don't have to memorize the definition, right? If I were to ask you right now, what's the definition of executive function skills? Most people don't remember it, and I just showed you a slide on it. But these are meant to be intuitive, and then you start to see it in everyday activities with young children. You can see these skills in action or ways to encourage them. Okay, me skills. Focusing attention on self-management, right? And that includes self-awareness, self-control, impulse control, and I was adding in things like attention and focus. Now, I promised I'm going to incorporate early literacy and books and library and things in this specifically. I would like to think that having a young child getting to practice things like focus and attention and impulse control, you can imagine how that might come into play at circle time or reading a book. Because remember, those skills don't really rapidly develop until the ages of 3 to 5. And we need to think of that as giving them opportunities to practice. And in fact, one of the best ways to teach or encourage attention doesn't happen overnight. You can't do it by flashcards. I am convinced is by reading books frequently with young children. Okay. With those skills in mind, what I want to flip over to, and again, I'm not going to go into all how this relates to the business world and things now, because that is a talk I typically give, but what I want to do is here dive into the developmental milestones quickly, so you can see how this relates to everyday milestones that you've probably talked about with pediatricians or that you deal with professionally or as a parent. Okay, 0 to 6 months, self-soothing, emotional awareness and social smile and focusing on faces, right? Increased self-awareness at 6 to 12 months, which is where you start to see babies responding to their names and seeing themselves in the mirror, right? Recognizing self. By 1 to 2 years, a clear sense of self and preferences with increased focus and attention. Again, not high expectations here. This is not where you've got lots of impulse control, but you start to see it, starting to get that do it myself, like it's about me and what can I do. And there is a little bit of that center of the universe element of it, right? Because you see yourself, and then it starts to be, now you need to expand into how you see yourself in the greater world. By age 3 is where you start to even be able to define it, maybe verbally, right? The words I and me and mine, emerging self-control, that then by 4 develops into these sort of me skills and less me-centric, right? That you have some control, like you may want to do something, but you hold back on it. Now, what I added in are some quick tips, and these are all in more detail in the Toddler Brain at the end of every chapter. But first of all, you need to model this because kids are watching, right? And for example, when you're even doing things like looking at an object, which could be in a book, right? Pointing at a book, how long a parent looks at the object relates to how long the infant will focus on the same object. Okay, so that's an important one. Establishing routines, right? So that a child starts to learn routines, because to follow a routine takes control, right? Enhanced emotional vocabulary and expression. So when a very young child is expressing emotions, you can help put words to those emotions. Again, books are great for enhanced emotional vocabulary and pointing out facial expressions and things, but helping kids have the words, learn the words, hear the words that they can then use to describe how they are feeling, right? So that they have self-awareness of their feelings and emotions. Considering time away instead of time out. Time out is a punishment usually given to kids because they're being bad and they're going to be punished for it. If instead you say a child needs some time to gather themselves, right, to kind of calm down, get themselves back into a mode that's less impulsive and that's more sort of these budding executive function skills, then time away takes away some of the temptations and frustrations and whatever else may be triggering the impulsive behavior. So if you think of it as time away, it's a positive. How do you help your child learn to control their emotions? And then play time to practice, right? Taking turns, role playing. And if you've heard the take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, these ideas of calming yourself down and getting yourself back into that sort of control mode all relate to me skills. I'm not going to belabor this point, but I had to put it in for this audience. A couple books, but there's lots of them. Some of them I reference at the back of the Toddler Brain, but quite honestly, I think it'd be fun to have people submit or think about all the books you read and start to look for the key skills in them, or how could you teach key skills or encourage key skills while you're reading them. But things like go, 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 stop that you see here, there's controlling your own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Well, this would be your actions, right? Like physical control of what you want to be doing. So the stop and go kinds of games. Your own emotions, what do you do and how do you express yourself and how do you put words to your emotions, like when I feel sad or the way that I feel. Okay, those are just a couple examples. There could be like 1,000 more on here, but I'll keep going. Next skill, we skills. Those are the people skills that include things like emotional intelligence, social emotional skills, language, empathy, perspective taking, basically what it takes to communicate well with others, or in more child-friendly language, it's learning to play well with others, okay? Again, very, very popular in the business and adult world as well. In fact, emotional intelligence happens to be 2 of the hottest words in corporate America and around the world. But we're going to skip over that element because I want to go to the milestones. I'm going to let you take a look at this because, again, if I read all of these to you, I'm going to go over on time to your Q&A time. But what you see is the things that you've already heard, that you already recognize. Now, do you see how they fit into a we skill context, right? You've got things like a social smile for anybody who's had a child or interacted with babies where you go, wait, was that gas or did they smile at me? Here's the thing, wherever that smile originated from, if there's that back and forth, that serve and return interaction with a caring, responsive adult who gets excited about that smile, and then the baby senses your emotions and reacts to it, and then you react and then they react, or the same thing, cooing and those sorts of things, which then pops in at 4 months, that is social interaction. It is communication and connectedness with another human being, and it is the absolute roots and foundation of emotional intelligence, empathy, perspective taking, all these things that are recognized as things that could solve some of the world's problems, right? People, President Obama, I think, had a quote saying what the world really needs is a bit more empathy, right, to solve the world's problems. Okay, so you've gone through these, you see this language, great way to communicate, right? Listening to other people, right? So it's not just all about me anymore, but it's how do I fit in the bigger context? And by 3 to 5, rapidly developing social abilities, right? This is the use your words, take turns, learn to play nice with others and in the same sandbox concept, as well as pretend play and perspective taking, because again, pretend play draws on perspective taking. I like to point out to people, when you hear emotional intelligence, by definition, when you look at the 5 core components, it's what I have now simplified into me and we skills combined. So me and we skills combined make up what you will hear in the adult world and in lots of the psychology literature and in the business world, emotional intelligence, EQ, social emotional, all those sorts of things. Okay, why skilds? Meant to be intuitive, as you might imagine. I'm sorry, hang on a second. I forgot to do this slide for you. These are I forgot I added in the tips for you to see. So how do you do this? I reference, it's the things like practicing putting your listening ears on, repeating that for kids, giving them chances to practice and explaining when that would be useful to do. Helping kids learn to use their words, right? To learn to express themselves and have the vocabulary to do it. Practicing playing nice, right, with others. Walking in someone else's shoes, which can literally be a matter of walking in someone else's shoes, because when you do that, you pretend to be someone else. You have to think about how do they talk, how would they walk, what would they say, what would they do. And here's where, for this audience, I often reinforce for the rest of the world, I am a huge early literacy advocate, and I often tell people, but I also will point out that it is just as important to learn to read other people as it is to learn to read books. But the beauty of it is, this would be my best example, because again, you can use books to help elaborate on all of this so well, because you've got listening, you've got turn taking, recognizing what someone else wants to do, you've got expressions in the books, and what do we think the characters are feeling and thinking, and what are they saying, and why do you think that, you know, the big red dog is upset, or whatever it would be. Books are probably the best way to do that. And then I also put baby signs in here, because being able to communicate with others is a people skill, right? So this is how to encourage we skills in a we world. And I did forget that I put these in here. You'll see that for both me and we skills, it actually blends together in terms of book choices, because especially for young children, helping them recognize how to name and identify emotions and perspectives and listening and all those things to other people is how they also learn how to do it for themselves. So you get that me part and the we part. But here are some examples of how are you peeling foods with moods. Gives lots of, you know, cute examples, but ways to describe much broader vocabulary of emotional terminology. Feelings book, Todd Parr. But baby sign language is a really early way. And we'll get to one of the other skills it applies to also, but for even very young nonverbal babies, just be able to better express themselves as their language skills are still ramping up. All right, there's 3 quick examples. Here's what I jumped to when I wasn't looking at my slides. The why skills. And this is where I said all of these are meant to be intuitive. So if I said, what do you think why skills would be? It's questioning, curiosity, right? The skills necessary to better understand the world that we live in and how it works, okay? So questioning, curiosity, inquisitiveness. Hugely valued. And remember, in a world where people will hopefully all have lots more access to information, it becomes less important who just knows the right answer than who knows how to ask good questions and sort of use their critical thinking and questioning to get to the right answer, because you're going to have to wade through this fire hose of information. Okay. I also like some of these quotes. This one by Albert Einstein, lots of quotes around questioning. The important thing is to not stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. All right. Again, keeping going, developmental milestones of why, of questioning. And what I like to point out here, and anyone who works in the capacity that all of you do, parents, educators, etc., hopefully recognize that babies are asking lots of questions about the world before they're actually literally verbally asking questions. So I put in 0 to 2 months, lots of unspoken questions, right? And lots of observations about the world even before they can express themselves. At 2 to 6 months, we see it manifested in physical activities, right? Reaching and grabbing and putting in the mouth and repeating. And what I often tell people, and this is very much a developmental milestone of early literacy, but also a way that I would train people in the reach out and read model, was if I saw a parent and with a baby in my pediatric office, say a 9-month-old, and the baby was putting the book in their mouth, unfortunately, all too often I'd see a parent sort of smack the book away, smack the hand, do whatever, sort of disciplining this child, sort of like, you should know better, don't put the book in your mouth. What I would do, and what I trained pediatricians to do, is say, oh, you know what? Your baby must really like books, because that's what 9-month-olds do, right? I mean, starting 2 to 6 months, but certainly by 9 months, if they're interested in something, they put it in their mouths. Like, your baby already likes books. Like, that's awesome. And then all you have to do is say, look, somebody got really smart, created board books so that they are more durable, or the ones that don't tear. And you can shift that entire dynamic between a parent and an infant so that they think their baby is smart and loves books, as opposed to needs to be disciplined for putting a book in their mouth and having it taken away. 1 to 2 years, naming, exploring, and basic questioning. Now, think about this in the context of books, because you've got pointing and identifying things. And this is where I always say, there are times when you don't want to disrupt a whole class or a circle time and you want to read a story. But there are plenty of times when there is absolutely as much value to stopping and letting a child, especially if you're doing one-on-one reading, where they get to point at something and then they want to turn the page back again, and then they want to point at it again, and you can repeat the word, and you can see what their interests are, and you've got this back and forth response, where you get to see what they're curious in, you get to give them more information about what they're curious in, and at the same time, it's this shared interactive activity that is so good for child development. And lastly, that enhanced vocabulary kicking in at age 3 to 5, increased frequency and complexity of questioning. And here's where I always say, listen, I had 3 kids in 3.5 years. It can be very challenging. And again, in a childcare setting with a whole lot of kids, a bunch of 3-year-olds, they ask a whole lot of questions. And there are times when it's less appropriate than others, but what we have to be careful of is not squelch their inherent desire to ask questions. So here's where I'll go through these. And again, I am running a little bit over, but we started a little, or at least I started a little bit after the hour. Be sure to answer those unasked questions, right? Before kids are verbal. The question yourself and then answer it, right? So that you're providing kids with that information even before they're verbal. Ask questions of your own. Why do you think they did this? What do you think is going to happen next? How do you think that works, right? Even before kids can answer them. And also be sure to praise the questions, not just having the right answer. I've already kind of belabored that point. Increase your Q to A ratio. Be sure to ask more questions than answers, right? And just make sure that you increase the number of questions you're asking so that you're modeling questioning behavior, saying it's good to think this thing through and ask questions. Do teach manners to go with it. So it's not just ask questions whenever you feel like it and just no matter what anybody else is doing. Beware of discouraging them, even if you need a child to stop for a moment or, save their question till later. And turn to books for it, right? It's a prop. It engages kids' curiosity, all those things that you want. Here, I basically take any book you want, right? Pick a book kids are interested in, pick books and ask what did they like the best, let the young kids turn the pages and point to things, elaborate on something that they're interested in the book, and just plain read a story because it engages them in ideas and thinking and understanding about how the world works. Will, so we've got me, we, why, will. We're on 4 of 7. Here's where I'm gonna have to pick up my pace. Will is self-motivation or drive, okay? And those skills, as you see here, list all these things where it's basically the stick with it, can-do kind of attitude, right? Very highly valued in today's world where people are expected to be self-motivated, and this idea that you do it because you want to be rewarded, like it's internally rewarding to accomplish something, not because somebody's going to pay you to do it or make you do it, okay? So we all value that, like the kid who's just going to stick with it and get the job done, all right? If we think about those sorts of skills, will skills, and again, there's all sorts of business analogies and discussion around it, and then the early childhood, what we see is that sort of determination at each of the ages, whether it's rolling and reaching and babbling and imitating, like determined to do these things. Like there's this internal drive in very young children, like in infancy. And we see it, kids determined to walk, right? A lot of toddlers, they fall over, right? But they're determined to keep doing it. They're determined to feed themselves. And by 2, this is where you get what people call the terrible 2s often is because kids want to do it themselves. They want to do it their way and do it themselves. Don't overlook that budding will skill, that motivation, because you don't want to take that away, even though some of the tantrums can be challenging. And then the 3 to 5-year-olds, the enhanced abilities allow for them to do more in the way of figuring things out, trying things, assembling things, and becoming more independent. And you want to let them do that. This is the list of things you can do to either not squelch it or to encourage it, but avoid. If you do this, I will give you that. If you eat your broccoli, I will give you ice cream. If you get an A in your class, I will pay you $1. Again, those things tend to work. Those external rewards, sticker charts and things are hotly debated, but they tend to work in the short term, but they do absolutely nothing for internal motivation. And they also do nothing. And in fact, they work against creativity, which is something we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay. So instead of saying, if you do, it's the, oh my gosh, if you build this, if you accomplish this, it's the accomplishment itself that is the reward, right? Model self-motivated behavior. And by the way, what I often use, I'm going to divert here, even though I see the time. Potty training is a really good example, because if ever there was a task where the accomplishment of the task, pee and poop and potty, should be the reward itself, it would be potty training. At which point I always ask people, explain to me will pee for M&Ms. We literally take something that should be the reward just in accomplishing it, and we say, I'll give you candy if you do it, and then kids expect candy, right, to do it. So we need to think about limiting that, motivating self-motivated behavior, that you're willing to stick with things even when they're not easy. Resist swooping in when a child's trying to stack the biggest to smallest blocks, but they're not quite getting it right. Let them play with it. Let them try to figure it out. Don't just show them how to do things. Anticipate the battle of the wills. Make it a point to recognize the perseverance. It doesn't have to be that you built the puzzle, but wow, did you put a lot of effort into trying to figure it out? Goals, setting goals and increasingly difficult goals, and then picking up on passions, because when kids have something that they're excited, passionate, curious about, it helps them build those will skills. And of course, it's the little engine that could is the model book, but lots of opportunities in books for that. I am sorry, we're getting late here on my what I promised I wouldn't do. Wiggle skills. This one is just a fun one, and I'm going to give my book example for it, because what I like to point out is that physical and intellectual restlessness go hand in hand. And we know this because look in the adult world how we talk about agile movers and shakers who take action, set stretch goals, actively reach for the stars. All that action is really highly valued. In fact, every renowned innovator is described as having been physically restless. And now think about what we call young children. Ants in their pants, can't sit still. It's never positive. And reading would be a potentially very significantly good example to that, which is sit still, crisscross, applesauce, don't touch your friends, don't move, don't grab, don't do anything else. We're reading a book now. At which point I used to ask my teachers, whoever said that reading aloud has to be a stationary activity? Yes, you need to learn to figure out how not to disturb the whole group. But sometimes being able to move and do things helps kids learn as they interact with things, okay? So physical milestones, these are the ones that people are most familiar with usually, I can say as a pediatrician, which is the head control and taking control of movements and being able to roll and sit, and then the fine motor control, which for books means you start to be able to turn pages, being able to more physically explore things as you get up into the 1, 2, and definitely to the 3-year-old age range, and then 4 to 5. So again, these are the basic milestones, but what we do is recognizing that looking, touching, poking, grabbing may be challenging to oversee, but it is your child's way of physically interacting and understanding the world. And I'm going to give you, you can look at the rest of the list here, but what I'm going to give you is my book example, because one of my favorite examples to use here is if you have a child or children who are very antsy, can't sit still, really want to move, and you want to have story time, as opposed to saying, well, if you don't sit still, we're not going to keep reading. I suggest things like jump, frog, jump. Let the kids get up and jump while you're reading. Or for the kids who just have to play, give them something to play with. For my 3 kids, I used to let them build puzzles. And all of a sudden I ended up with like a 3, 5, and 6-year-old who could sit for an hour or 2 and listen to books as long as they were doing something. Or on the other side, baby touch and feel animals. Let children handle and interact with the books. And again, more challenging when you're dealing with a big group of kids, but this idea of physically interacting with what they're inquiring and interested in is important. All right, adaptability skills. These are the wobble skills, and it's one of my favorite terms. People love the idea. This is the idea of educating children who are fit to fail. But the wobble concept, you can look at the kind of terminology here. The wobble concept comes from Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. It is that you can fall back, wobble back and forth, right? Take risks and have some failures, but not major failures, right? Never tip all the way over. And for people who don't know, Weebles, egg-shaped toys with a big weight at the bottom, got hugely popular in the 80s and for decades and decades and globally known. And faces were painted on those eggs, but because they had the weight, they could tip back and forth, but they would never fall all the way over, okay? The ability to fail and adapt is incredibly valued in today's world of rapid change. And when I always tell people, I say, okay, now can you tell me the developmental milestones of wobble? And the fact of the matter is you can't, because milestones are accomplishments, right? And what we tend to do is we celebrate the accomplishment and not the effort and the ability to wobble and adapt. Okay, so the concept here to keep in mind is allow for failure early and often. Remember to celebrate that and make sure you differentiate between sort of taking risks and really risky behavior. This is not don't wear a seatbelt, don't wear a bike helmet kind of risk, but this is let kids try something, fail, try again, accomplish it on their own, because it's very valuable. And 2 really good stories about this are Beautiful Oops and A Perfectly Messed Up Story, but looking at saying, what do you learn and what can you get, or how do you take something that might be seen as a mistake and make it more positive? All right, and last skill, and I'm only a few minutes over, what if skills. Okay, now you see that these are the possibility skills that help us not just understand how the world works, the why skills. I mean, what if is a question about how the world works, but it's not just how the world works, but how the world could be. Okay, and it's the ability to imagine something that's not immediately in front of you. So that fits in with these ideas of innovation, imagination, creativity, open-mindedness, out-of-the-box thinking, and all. And I will tell you that a global survey of 1,500 CEOs found creativity to be the single most valued skill. And everybody seems to love innovation and what goes with that, the imagination and creativity and those sorts of things, okay? And so this is where I say imagining a world of possibilities, and imagining something that's not immediately in front of you, and then figuring out how to make that happen. But notice that I do say at the end of this list, hope, because I'm going to touch on that in just a minute. We're going to get to the milestones here just to run through them really quickly, because this is one where people haven't always thought about it. But 4 to 7 month olds begin to understand that objects and people still exist even when they can't be seen, right? Something that's not immediately in front of them, or heard or touched. And that's the object permanence, right? When they don't see you, they know you're coming back. This is peekaboo with a 9 month old, right? By 1 to 2 years, you start to get kids starting to play pretend and figuring out new ways, like creative ways to use toys that they weren't necessarily designed for. And by 3 to 5 years, picture the child doing dress-up play with imaginary friends and thinking about things and making up stories. That creative world is hugely valuable as a skill. And we tend to sometimes, not this group probably, discount that as that's playtime, but now we need to get to work. And this is really valuable for children, okay? And so, again, reading about it, here's the deal. When you are reading and a child's listening to you, it actually activates the part of a brain that does not get activated with watching television, for example. The creative sort of imagining, it's the mind's eye, okay? It's triggering the part of the brain that's able to imagine something that's not immediately in front of them. Toys that are open-ended do that, right? So it doesn't have to be a very specific task to the toy. Praising ideas and asking thought-provoking questions, because you can get some pretty creative answers. Playing along, it's not just letting kids play kind of freeform, which is important, but also helping them directed so that they start to do some play where they might structure sort of a, you know, preschool version of a play, or pretending to do something and having some structure to it. Telling stories, filling in the end of a story, those sorts of things. And to go along with that, unplugging, because you do not get the same level of creative thought and interaction and engagement with most of any of the technologies they can think of. Make sure you question your rules. If there's a creative way that your child comes up with to doing something and it's not the way that you've told them to do it, it's good to kind of think about, maybe you appreciate what they've done. Let kids color outside the lines and let them be bored, because a lot of creative thought comes from when someone's trying to figure out what to do, as opposed to having everything just presented and always engaging them. All right. And I am a big Peter Reynolds fan for this. The Create Trilogy. I always stumble over that one. Create Trilogy is Sky Color, The Dot, and Ish. And What Do You Do with an Idea? And for all the books I've referenced, by the way, I could have easily made the case that they apply to other skills as well, because all the skills are intertwined. Now, I'm going to close with the idea that what we really need to make sure we do with this idea of what I mentioned, hope. Because hope represents the ability to imagine a world or a circumstance better than the one you're born into or are facing. And while all of this is great, and we've been talking about early childhood, I believe that if everyone, starting with children, does not have the ability to imagine that, to have hope, that we all are going to live in a world we don't want to live in. And so this is this concept of we need to focus on key for all. And I'll let you read the quote here. And I'm going to flip it to the last page here so that if anyone's interested in some of my details, my social media, my TED Talks, whatever, you're welcome to take a look here. But I do apologize. I've gone a little bit over here, and I am going to flip right over to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second here. So take a screenshot or do whatever you'd like. And I will let Betsy jump in, I think, because that way we get to questions. Yes. I do apologize. That ran a bit over.
No, that was riveting. I have, a few more questions coming in. The first question is, you made the point that 85% of brain growth occurs during the first 3 years. Can you address a philosophy that people have that believes children can catch up later?
Well, I think, and again, this is where I'm very careful, because one of the things that worries me about this really big, I almost say it's a tsunami of interest in early childhood, right, for across a lot of sectors, is that the message is, if we don't get it right in the first 5 years, all hope is lost. Whether that's it's not intended that way for the most part. Can you get kids to help them catch up later? Yes. That was that curve that shows that you can teach a 70-year-old, you can teach a 70-year-old, you can do interventions with high school students, and they are effective. But the way I like to explain this one, if you remember that Heckman curve, right, where it just went straight like this, and you got the biggest return for the youngest age, and then it just went down. it's analogous. If the wiring of the brain is like the wiring of the house, it's like saying that it is entirely possible to rewire a 100-year-old house. It just always takes longer, costs more, and ends up being not quite as good as if you get the wiring right before the walls go up. Okay, so that would be the focus on early childhood is really important because we've got this great window of opportunity. But say, for example, a child comes from less than desirable circumstances, right? Or this wasn't done. You're hearing this now and you're thinking, oh no, I've got a 5-year-old and I didn't do this. By all means, the beauty of the brain is that it's plastic and it can change. And these skills can be encouraged, cultivated, and learned in adulthood. But if we're going to focus our efforts on where to do it, recognizing that early childhood gives us this incredible opportunity, and it's doing fun things. Again, emphasizing the talking, cooing, and singing and reading books to babies. I'm not telling you to take cod liver oil, right? I'm telling you fun things, but recognize that what you're doing as a caring, responsive adult is perhaps the single most important factor in giving kids this strong foundation.
Okay. Okay, the next question I think will be of interest to everyone. Will socializing through a screen help with social learning?
That's an awesome question. I'd be surprised if I hadn't gotten one about technology because, especially with the pandemic now more than ever, but before the pandemic, everyone was wrestling with what to do about technology and especially in early childhood. Here's what we know. So there are a couple studies I referenced in the Toddler Brain specifically. Were things like a researcher who looked at, I think it was like 2 or 3-year-olds, and looking at their ability to learn social emotional skills through video. And these are high-end researchers. For those people who don't know it, Sesame Street's highly focused on taking this kind of high-level research and applying it. So it was one of the researchers that contributes to those, clips about social emotional learning on Sesame Street and things. And what she found was that a 2 or 3-year-old could learn new skills, but it might take multiple viewings for them to closely approximate what a child might gain at the same age from an in-person interaction with one interaction. So it's not as good, but again, when you're talking about, for example, using screens or nothing, then you say, yes, there's value in screens. There's potential there to help get kids up who may not have that rich interaction available. The younger the child, the more we know that they get, the less out of it, okay? And this is why, if anybody remembers when Disney was sued for their Baby Einstein videos and had to, refund money, it's because you can't claim something's educational if you can show it forwards or backwards and have the same effect. Okay, does not mean it's not engaging, because there is a huge industry for children and adults to capture your attention, right? It's an attention, that's the whole role of social media, is how do we grab and keep your attention? That's what media is doing to us. But grabbing a child's attention is not the same thing as cultivating all these skills. So the ideal is human interactions. Now, if you want a definitive source on this, I am involved with the American Academy of Pediatrics on their growing up digital efforts and how do you help parents raise children. There is a family guide to digital media use, both for young children and for older children, at the AAP website. But if you want to have the summary of what they found or what they suggest, it's that you use, first of all, co-viewing, that there's quality of content, that just like I would tell somebody, take a book, and if you read a book about, baking cookies, then maybe you take it into the real world and you go bake some cookies. Or if you read a book about a butterfly, you go on a walk and look for butterflies. Taking what you might do, and ideally interactively, especially with young children, on media using technology, and bringing it into the real world and discussing it. The other thing is, and this is especially true during the pandemic, is the ability to interact with other people. So, the example we used to use all the time before the pandemic made it apply to pretty much everybody was a military family where one parent is away. Using it for interaction like this, but for example, story time or a parent being able to talk to a child is really valuable. So it's not just about the time, it's about the quality of content, ideally co-viewing, co-interacting with media, bringing it into the real world, and really minimizing the amount in those earliest years, because again, like I said, for infants, we know that there's a social switch that needs to be flipped to get the really ideal kind of learning that we want.
Thank you. The slide mentions that an 18-month-old's vocabulary predicts 3rd grade reading success. And can you clarify that? Does that mean the 10 to 20 word average used for their milestone? Does it include quality of the words? And what about understanding versus being able to verbalize those
Well,
words?
absolutely. And what I didn't have time to elaborate on is that also is not meant that if you have an 18-month-old who's slower to pick up on their vocabulary, that they're destined to not have good third grade reading scores and like their life is predicted for them. What it means as a whole, when you study sort of populations of children, is that when we see children not moving along on their vocabulary at 18 months. Now, there's an entire area of focus around language development, because if you'll recall the slide I showed where that first year language is coming online in a huge way. One of the top baby brain researchers, Pat Kuhl at the University of Washington Institute for Learning and Brain Science, is a language and baby brain researcher and world renowned for her work. And so what we do is a lot of times what we see is that the study of language development reflects brain development. It's one of the earliest things. And so that's where she will talk about, and it's not just the number of words, right? That was a simplified version of it to get people to pay attention to what happens in those early months and years. But absolutely, whoever asked the question, there's a thing called the 30 million word initiative, and there's talk, play, sing, talk, read, sing, a lot of them geared around what became an initial study of how many words children were exposed to early. And it was by socioeconomic class, and the lower number of words for lower socioeconomics and up. But then people realized it wasn't just the number of words, but it was the quality of words, and were they positive reinforcing versus negative disciplinary. So absolutely. And again, same thing for a child. This is no different than as a pediatrician. If a child can come into my office and, count to 100 when they're 3, but they don't know whether the number 3 is bigger than the number 5 or not, that doesn't tell us as much. So yes, there's a whole lot more depth to that concept, but as a sort of making the point that we know that what happens early from foundational brain development standpoint, earliest reflected in language development, that it actually matters a whole lot more than people have given it credit for, and that may be predictive. But again, it was never meant as a statistic for one individual person to say my 18-month-old. Now, I would say if an 18-month-old is not meeting the typical milestones that are easily found on I had them on here, but on the CDC website, the Learn the Signs Act Early campaign has all the developmental milestones of early childhood. I actually wrote a children's book for them called Amazing Me, It's Busy Being 3, that incorporates all of the developmental milestones for 3-year-olds. But if your child's not meeting those milestones, don't blow that up. I mean, don't just say, oh, we'll wait later. Don't let your pediatrician just say, well, we'll check next year, because there are things you can do to help that along if it's not happening.
Okay. What are the chances that kids who do not get a good start early in life can heal as adolescents or adults?
There's a really good chance. And this gets back to the one I'm glad we're getting, touching on it again, because it is so important to me for people to realize that there's a huge opportunity, that in no way, because I've focused my efforts on sort of this root cause, go to early childhood, take advantage of this window of opportunity. What I did was I went to an area that I felt was getting left out of these conversations. But I absolutely believe in and see hugely beneficial impacts from programs targeting older children, high school kids. And the thing that carries across all those ages that turns out to be one of the biggest predictors of a child with less than desirable start getting off their dismal trajectory and ending up having a better life trajectory is a caring, responsive adult. And that's true at all ages. And if people understand this brain science is permeating a lot, but if people understand how a child's brain is wired, and then recognize those behaviors where, for example, the amygdala is being triggered, that they then work with that child. One of the best examples, and I know that we're getting towards the end here, but one of the best examples that I've heard given on this is now the current Secretary of Health, whatever, for the state of California. But Nadine Burke-Harris describes that she's very big into these, dealing with kids' high poverty, adverse childhood experiences, and helping improve outcomes. But what she talked about with the brain, she said, listen, if a child has a seizure disorder, in our sort of education culture, that child has a whole plan in place at the school. If they have a seizure at school with the abnormal firing of neurons in their brain, that they're provided the space they need, the care they need. They can go to the nurse's office. They can get tended to. If a child acts up, throws a fit, all of a sudden you can't be reasoned with because their amygdala has been triggered, right? They feel threatened or whatever, and they lash out. What happens to that child when they have what we from our expectations would consider an abnormal firing of neurons in their brain, in the amygdala, based on the way their brain was wired? They tend to get suspended or expelled. And there's a documentary called Paper Tigers that came out years ago that basically made the case that these kids don't know the difference between a paper tiger and a real one, but the entire school, I think it was in Portland or it was in the Pacific Northwest where this documentary took place, they followed high school students around where everyone at the school, principal, administrators, teachers, janitors, you name it, counselors, all were trained in the same brain science and responded to the kids in a way that was recognizing that this is the way their brain's wired and we need to help rewire them into that much more controlled prefrontal kind of mentality over time. So absolutely, I am a huge supporter of those programs. I just think that if we're going to be wise about it, we should stop ignoring the potential for really big returns on investments in early childhood. But we should by no means stop or give up on older children and even adults.
Okay, well, we're a little past time. Do you want to take one more question, or are we?
I'm happy to, because like I said, my goal is to try to get people's questions. But these are great questions because these are the ones that when I'm in with an audience, I always get asked these questions, and I usually find lots of people are interested in them. So yeah, go right ahead.
I will say that for many of these questions, if they read your book, they will find the answers. This question, I think, though, might be interesting given the time we're in. Could you speak about the potential impact to children not being able to see and read faces, only eyes and eyebrows as their signs? I guess.
Yeah, I just got asked this question. Yeah, I was asked this question by somebody running efforts in Oklahoma just yesterday. And a lot of what we're dealing with the pandemic is going to be trade-offs, right? What we're seeing, and again, if people want to understand that the American Academy of Pediatrics just recommended that kids go back to school despite the fact that we're in a pandemic and all, it is a very explicit acknowledgement that social emotional interaction and overall well-being of children is really important, that human interaction is really important, but also that school is not just about reading, writing, arithmetic. I mean, lots of kids are dependent for food, for safety, for care, for services and mental health sort of elements and things, and counseling. So there's lots of elements to it. But with specific to the masks, on the one hand, we know that masks work to help limit the spread of infection, right, and viruses. And so it's important to wear them, right? On the other hand, I've just finished saying learning to read other people. So first of all, what I'd like to say is, obviously, I think that there's going to have to be a balance there. I think there's some discussion about whether it's 2 and above, which most places are recommending children 2 and above. So we're getting out of that first 18-month range that I referred to as being sort of the really big social switch. I think there's a lot to be said for eye expressions. When I talk to babies, I always see them moving their eyebrows. And I'm like, oh yes, I move my eyebrows a lot when I'm talking to babies. But eyes and eyebrows. And the other thing I said I would do is, first of all, if someone can find, and I think they're coming out with clear masks, that would be great. I think that when somebody who's got an infant around is able to, now if it's family member and you're within that bubble of who all can be around each other and potentially expose each other and not worry about it in that family unit or a couple people, by all means take your mask off, right, in that group within the family. But for example, an infant teacher in an infant room, I might spend more time outdoors because we know outdoors makes it less likely that it's in closed air spaces for spread of virus purposes. And I might take my mask off while I'm reading, but just be a little further away or turn my face a little bit away from children. So again, there is no one right answer. I think, again, because we're not really, we're not talking about 24 hours a day, and we're talking about the ability to see eyes. And right now, as we're figuring out the virus, the wearing of masks to prevent the spread is so important for getting the pandemic under control. I sort of fell on the side of, yes, I would do masks. I would see if I could find clear masks because that would be fantastic. And I think people are coming out with them now. And I would see if there's ways where I could be doing something where I wasn't as close, you know, that face-to-face with the baby, where I could take the mask off and do some things. Again, no one right answer. It's going to change as we go along. I think the World Health Organization just came out with a statement today that kids up until the age of 5 don't need to wear masks or shouldn't need to wear masks, whereas that's not what everyone, you know, the recommendations are here. The CDC, AAP saying ages 2 and above should be wearing masks for the kids as well as for the teachers. So it remains to be seen, but it's really good to be thinking about it and seeing where the trade-off is. Right now, I think it falls, at least in the short term here, for a matter of months, that during that time when you're around somebody who may potentially expose you, or a teacher may expose a child, wearing a mask during that time, and then trying to find times when there's not a mask is the best approach.
Okay, there we are. Lori, over to you. Thank you so much for answering those questions, and I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to answer all of them.
But as you said, Betsy, I think if people can get a hold of the Toddler Brain, a lot of the questions will be answered in there. It's wonderful. So thank you. Invigorating, exciting, important, energizing. It was terrific. I think we could have listened to you all night long.
When I can't see everybody, I'm like, am I boring people? Because if people are going to sleep.
No, I'm so excited by this. We also want to thank Indira for the interpretation service. I want to thank all of our wonderful library staff for putting tonight's event together. And thank you to all the audience who attended and stuck around with us. And thank you for caring about kids. Do remember to look for the email from Betsy tomorrow. And there will be a link to the prize drawing as well as the survey. You might be a lucky winner. For teachers who joined us, Molly, do you want to share your screen? If you would like to get child development credit hours, Lori Ann Armstrong is our Arapahoe Library's preschool literacy trainer, and her contact information is right there, as well as it will also be in the email tomorrow. So you can get that taken care of. Finally, we hope you'll visit arapahoelibraries.org and our 0 to 5 page to learn about other opportunities and story times and programs and resources for both kids and adults. And this event will be able to be found. There will be a link to share this with your friends and watch it again, which I know I will, on our YouTube channel, Arapahoe Library's YouTube channel. So watch for that, and there will be a link on our website. Okay, we hope you had a great evening. Again, thank you, Dr. Laura. And everyone go forth and change the world with the key skills. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Yeah, thank you. Great to join all of you.
Bye-bye.